Hello, my dearest members. We are back with another Social Stud Live post show. I'm actually changing the name of the Social Stud Live thing just to Social Stud. So it's just the Social Stud post show. And I've been using an abbreviation SSL when doing the post show stuff. But I can't really use an abbreviation for Social Stud because it would just be the SS post show. And I think being halfway historically literate, that is something that I would consider myself above having as the it would seem kind of tone deaf, would it not? So I'm gonna have to either call this just the post show or the Social Stud post show. I haven't decided what looks better in a title. It doesn't really matter, no big deal, whatever. I also hope that the audio is okay. I was having trouble with my microphone recently, still seem to be having trouble every time I turn it on, it seems. So I'm hoping all went well in today's show, and if it didn't, I'm sorry, and I'm hoping everything is going okay now. From the look of everything, it's all in order, so let's get into what we're doing here. Also, I hope the audio's doing okay with the music being mixed in. This is the first recording I've actually done with the music included, and I think it's well balanced, but if you have a preference for me to turn it up or down, I'm sure people will tell me during the live show whether or not it's good or bad. We'll see how it goes, whatever. So today, if you're new, we've been taking on Crash Course Government and Politics every other week, or maybe once every 3 weeks or so, whenever I feel like it. I want to return to one of the Crash Course series for the post show. So today we're going to be doing Government and Politics number 4 and number 5. The first video is on federalism. The second video is, constitutional compromises. That should be depressing yet interesting. It was a really delicate situation getting the Constitution together and bringing all these disjointed states into one big thing. Finding that one big national identity is something that we struggled with for a very long time, but one of the first big steps was the Constitution. We all have this common government that we're all under. But first, we have to get into federalism. We've already talked about the Federalist Party, which should not be confused for federalism. It's actually really confusing when you think of the Federalist Party. They're like this big government party. We want to increase the presence of the federal government because the federal government just had no power early on. So that's not necessarily what federalism is. Federalism is more like the balance of government. Well, I'm sure he's going to give us a much more thoughtful definition in this video. So I could go into a big rant about it, but that would kind of defeat the purpose of having this video here. And I'm curious if I'm going to be... I'm excited to learn new stuff about my government, and I'm sure there's plenty of little details that could be refined up here. So let's get this one started.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're going to talk about a fundamental concept in American government, federalism. Sorry. I'm not sorry. You're not even endangered anymore. Federalism is a little confusing because we use the word federal as in federal government, which is what we use to describe the government of the United States as a whole, which is kind of the opposite of what we mean when we say federalism. Confused? Google it. The video will probably come up, and then just watch this video. Or just continue watching this video.
Sounds lovely.
So what is federalism? Most simply, it's the idea that in the US, governmental power is divided between the government of the United States and the government of the individual states. The government of the US...
And that's something that has been very interesting in modern political discourse. It always comes back to federalism. Even though we rarely use the term in casual conversation, it always does come back to federalism. the Republican Party always prides itself on being the party of states' rights. In the COVID-19 pandemic, it's been a big conversation between who is best to take on the pandemic, the federal government or the state governments, and it's largely been taken care of by the state government. The federal government has come into play here and there. They've dished out the stimulus checks and whatnot, but more or less the federal governments have been a bit weaker on this issue than the state governments, to, of course, mixed results. But in theory, who is better to take care of the issues that affect a single state? Probably the representatives of that state. The reason we have a federal government is because there's often things that one state does that impacts another state, and the federal government, in a lot of ways, is kind of a mediating body. While it has representatives from the different states, a lot of what it does impacts things that happen in between states. Things that exist here just as much as they exist in Texas.
West, the national government is sometimes called the federal government, while the state governments are just called the state governments. This is because technically the U.S. can be considered a federation of states, but this means different things to different people. For instance, federation of states means ham sandwich to me. I'll have one federation of states, please. Side of tater tots. Thank you. I'm kind of dumb. In a federal system, the national government takes care of some things, like, for example, war with other countries and delivering the mail, while the state government takes care of other things like driver's license, hunter's license, barber's license, dentist's license, license to kill. That's James Bond, and that's in England, and that, I hope states don't do that. Pretty simple, right? Maybe not. For one.
And there's a reason why you wouldn't want just the state governments being able to just send their own little militaries wherever they wanted, because it could pull the other states into a conflict that they're not prepared for. There could be places in the country where the military could be sent somewhere. Like, let's say there's like a divide on the issue of whether or not to invade a certain country. The places that are cool with it, they would just send the people out there. If there wasn't some sort of a large federal oversight that kept it so that we're all kind of in this together. And that's something that I really like about the federal government. It gets a bad rep sometimes, but a lot of things in theory I get. Like, we don't want to be pulled into Ohio's wars. I don't know, just picking a state at this point. North Dakota decides to invade Canada tomorrow, and they send the North Dakotan army there. Well, no, there isn't really a North Dakotan army. They might have their own militias. I don't know what militia culture is like over there, but it's different from it's different from it being like its own country, in that we kind of all have to come together and decide that this is a good decision. I don't know. Am I rambling? I'm rambling. Sorry.
One thing, there are some aspects of government that are handled by both the state and the national government. Taxes, Americans' favorite government activity, are an example.
I have to do taxes very soon.
But it gets even more complicated because there are different types of federalism depending on what period in American history you're talking about. Stan, why is history so confusing? Stan, you gonna tell me? Can you talk, Stan? Basically, though, there are two main types of federalism. Dual federalism, which has nothing to do with Aaron Burr, usually refers to the period of history that stretches from the founding of our great nation until the New Deal. And cooperative federalism, which has been the rule since the 1930s. Let's start with an easy one and look at dual federalism, in the thought bubble. From 1788 until 1937, the U.S. basically lived under a regime of dual federalism, which meant government power was strictly divided between the state and national governments. Notice I didn't say separated, because I don't want you to confuse federalism with separation of powers. Don't do it! With dual federalism, there are some things that only the federal government does and some things that only the state governments do. This is sometimes called jurisdiction. The national government had jurisdiction over internal improvements like interstate roads and canals, subsidies to the states, and tariffs, which are taxes on imports and thus fall under the general heading of foreign policy. The national government also owns public lands,
and these are issues that are bigger than any one individual state. And like, if you are building, let's say, highways in between states, who gets to make the call as to how they're built or whatever, or where they're placed, or like how does one state and another state come together and make that decision? They might be able to compromise, but then you have a federal government who could just come in and make the decision that is best for the country on the whole. It's really interesting. But we always have to remember the federal government has its own like interstate conflict existing between it. It's made up of representatives from the different states. So it's not just this big entity that's simply above the states' rights issue. Often it's a contributor to the states' rights issues. So plenty of people get into the federal government and would rather the federal government do less. It's not like a black and white relationship. There's so many layers to what motivates people in these positions.
Regulates patents, which need to be national for them to offer protection for inventors in all the states. And because you want a silver dollar in Delaware to be worth the same as a silver dollar in Georgia, the national government also controls currency. The state government had control over property laws, I always bring this up. My state, early on, we were big into printing paper money. We were down with the paper money early on. A lot of people were not really fond of it, but we printed this paper money and expected other people to accept it, even though it was totally useless. It's kind of hilarious. It's one of my favorite little bits of Rhode Island history because it just really exemplifies how much of a pain in the buttocks we were to the surrounding states. Insurance laws, commercial laws, banking laws, corporate laws, insurance, family law, which means marriage and divorce, morality, stuff like public lewdness and drinking, keeps me in check, public health, education, criminal laws, including determining what is a crime and how crimes are prosecuted, land use, which includes water and mineral rights, elections, local government, and licensing of professions and occupations, basically what's required to drive a car, or open a bar, or become a barber, or become James Bond. So, under dual federalism, the state government has jurisdiction over a lot more than the national government. These powers over health, safety, and morality are sometimes called police power and usually belong to the states. Because of the strict division between the two types of government, dual federalism is sometimes called layer cake federalism. Delicious. And it's considered—
I've never heard that one. That's interesting.
—that many Americans hold very dear. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Now, some of you might be wondering, Craig, where does the national government get the power to do anything that has to do with states? Yeah, well, off the top of my head, the U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. This is what's known as the Commerce Clause, and the way that it's been interpreted forms the basis of dual federalism and cooperative federalism. For most of the 19th century, the Supreme Court decided—
And the inclusion specifically of the Indian tribes, like, yes, that definitely carries on in a form today, but you kind of get the sense that the level of importance to be included there is a product of its time. Like yeah, it is still a thing today, but our relationship with the Amerindian tribes is just it's so much different now from what it once was. Is there still hostility? Yes, but it's like a different, it takes a different form in a lot of ways.
Decided that almost any attempt by any government, federal or state, to regulate state economic activity would violate the Commerce Clause. This basically meant that there was very little regulation of business at all.
Cocaine.
Freedom! And this is how things stood, with the U.S. following a system of dual federalism with very little government regulation, and the national government not doing much other than going to war, buying or conquering enormous amounts of territory, and delivering the mail. Then the Great Depression.
And
other than going to war, buying or conquering enormous—
That's the Louisiana Purchase. Look how big the Louisiana Purchase is. It's not just the state of Louisiana, which is included at the bottom here. You didn't even get the whole state that would become Louisiana, but like, look how huge this is. It was a steal, man. Like, Napoleon must have been really, really desperate to have given all that up.
Enormous amounts of territory and delivering the mail. Then the Great Depression
doubled the country.
Franklin Roosevelt and Congress enacted the New Deal, which changed the role of the federal government in a big way. The New Deal brought us cooperative federalism, where the national government encourages states and localities to pursue nationally defined goals. The main way that the federal government does this is through dollar bills, y'all. Money is what I'm saying. Stan, can I make it rain? Yeah? All right, I'm doing it. I happen to have cash in my hand right now. Oh yeah, take my federal money, states. Regulating you. A regulator. This money that the federal government gives to the state is called a grant and aid. Grants and aid can work like a carrot, encouraging a state to adopt a certain policy, or work like a stick when the federal government withholds funds if a state doesn't do what the national government wants. Grants.
So, yeah, this is what I guess one could consider like soft regulation versus hard regulation. Hard regulation is we are by force going to make you do something. Soft regulation, and I'm sure you could apply these terms in other ways, but soft regulation in this case would be you just kind of incentivize somebody to make the decision that you want them to make, or instead of incentivizing them, you kind of show that life will be a little bit harder without your help. Here's a example from today, like mask mandates. This isn't exactly a perfect example of like federal and state government interacting, but I think it follows a similar principle of different kinds of regulation. A hard mandate would be you have to wear the mask. If not, some guys are gonna come and arrest you for breaking mask laws. A soft mandate would be, hey, you should wear the mask. You don't have to wear it, but if you don't wear it, you're not going to be able to get into certain stores, certain buildings. Your life is going to be a little bit harder because you're not going to have access to a lot of the stuff that you want. So that's kind of a soft mandate. They're not necessarily forcing you to wear it. They're just making your life a little bit more difficult for you to not wear it. The same thing applies to vaccine mandates. There are hard vaccine mandates where they just say you have to do this, or there are soft vaccine mandates where it's like, okay, you don't have to do it, but your life is going to be a lot easier if you do. You're going to have to work around some regulations if you don't. You're going to have to get tested this many times in a certain amount of time period or whatever. That's I guess the way of tying this kind of this like carrot and stick approach to like a modern problem in a way that's not just like federal government state government relationship. It's kind of a strategy that can be applied in a lot of places.
Grants and aid are usually called categorical because they're given to states for a particular purpose, like transportation or education or alleviating poverty. There are two types of categorical grants and aid: formula grants and project grants. Under a formula grant, a state gets aid in a certain amount of money based on a mathematical formula. The best example of this is the old way welfare was given in the U.S. under the program called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC. States got a certain amount of money for every person who was classified as poor. The more poor people a state had, the more money it got. Project grants require states to submit proposals in order to receive aid. The states compete for a limited pool of resources. Nowadays, project grants are more common than formula grants, but neither is as popular as block grants, which the government gives out Lego blocks and then you build stuff with the Legos. It's a good time. No, where the national government gives a state a huge chunk of money for something big like infrastructure, which is made with concrete and steel, not Legos, and the state is allowed to figure out how to spend the money. The basic type of cooperative federalism is the carrot-stick type, which is sometimes called marble cake federalism because it mixes up the state and federal governments in ways that makes it impossible to separate the two. Federalism, it's such a culinary delight. The key to this is, you guessed it, dollar bills, y'all, money. But there's another aspect of cooperative federalism that's really not so cooperative, and that's regulated federalism. Under regulated federalism, the national government sets up regulations and rules that the states must follow. Some examples of these rules, also called mandates, are EPA regulations, civil rights standards, and the rules set up by the Americans with Disabilities Act. Sometimes the government gives the states money to implement the rules, but sometimes it doesn't, and they must comply anyway. That's called an unfunded mandate, or as I like to call it, an unfun mandate, because no money, no fun. A good example of this is OSHA.
And that would be kind of like a hard mandate in that sense. Like if they applied some level of force to make them do it without like incentivizing it, that would be closer to like what I described as a hard mandate.
Regulations that employers have to follow. States don't like these, and Congress tried to do something about them with the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, or UMRA, but it hasn't really worked. In the early 21st century, Americans are basically living under a system of cooperative federalism with some areas of activity that are heavily regulated. This is a stretch from the original idea that federalism will keep the national government small and have most government functions belong to the states. If you follow American politics, and I know you do, this small government ideal should sound familiar because it's the bedrock principle of many conservatives and libertarians in the US. As conservatives made major political inroads after the 1970s, a new concept of federalism, which was actually kind of an old concept of federalism, became popular. It was called, surprise, New Federalism, and it was popularized by Presidents Nixon and Reagan. Just to be clear, it's called New Federalism, not surprise, New Federalism. New federalism basically means giving more power to the states, and this has been done in three ways. First, block grants allow states discretion to decide what to do with federal money. And what's a better way to express your power than spending money? Or not spending money, as the case may be. Another form of new federalism is devolution, which is the process of giving state and local governments the power to enforce regulations, devolving power from the national to the state level. Finally, some courts have picked up the cause of new federalism through cases based on the 10th Amendment, which states, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." The idea...
Yeah, that is something that's always been a contentious bit of the Constitution. Since early on, we've kind of worked around that with a concept known as implied powers, which seems to fly in the face of all of this. Hold on, let me...
States are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people.
So... the idea was that if it didn't specifically state that the federal government had a certain power, it did not have that power. However, thanks to people like Alexander Hamilton, who interpreted the Constitution kind of liberally, there was the idea of implied powers, that a government would need certain powers in order to execute its greater duties that may not be specifically mentioned in here, which this says like it's got to be actually mentioned in here, but you're able to kind of like twist and bend and morph the Constitution to make it what you want. That's one of the things with law. I often say this more about common law, but like it's like religion. If you understand scripture well enough, you can make it mean whatever you want. And sorry, my bird's being a pain. That's what they did that's what they continue to do with the law. They kind of twist it and bend it and interpret it more and more liberally over time. And sometimes it moves back and they interpret it slightly more conservatively. There's a give and take to it. But the meaning of a lot of this is to make the Constitution mean stuff that is more relevant to modern people, so that the Constitution belongs to the people today, and people in the past may not have anticipated the problems that we would have today, and they didn't write it necessarily for us. They wrote it for their own time. So some believe that we have to be able to interpret things in a way that more fits our modern day problems, which it's interesting. I can understand it.
The idea that some powers, like those police powers I talked about before, are reserved by the states has been used to put something of a brake on the Commerce Clause. So, as you can see, where we are with federalism today is kind of complicated. Presidents Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Clinton seem to favor new federalism and block grants. But George W. Bush seemed to push back towards regulated federalism with laws like No Child Left Behind and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. It's pretty safe to say that we're going to continue to live under a regime of cooperative federalism with a healthy dose of regulation thrown in. But many Americans feel that the national government is too big and expensive and not what the framers wanted. If history is any guide, a system of dual federalism with most of the government in the hands of the states is probably not going to happen. For some reason, it's really difficult to convince institutions to give up powers once they've got them. I'm never giving up this power. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course Government and...
All right, so next we have, what is it? What was it again? Constitutional compromises. Yes, that is going to be an interesting one. We get to confront the slavery issue, which is a very interesting one that is often misunderstood when people learn about this stuff. So it should be an interesting conversation to have.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics. And today we're going to talk about the single most important document in America, one that we'll be talking about a lot over the next few months. No, I'm not talking about O Magazine. It's the United States Constitution, and what we're really going to focus on is how it got made and how it became the foundation of our government.
Yo.
Those of you who watched the U.S. History series...
I wonder, what's the one after this? Now we're doing, okay, congressional elections. Yeah, we're doing a deep dive here. That'll be fun.
With John Green, probably remember that the government set up by the Constitution is actually the second attempt at an American government. Also, as pointed out in the comments, you probably noticed that I am not John Green. The first American government was in place during the Revolutionary War, and for almost 10 years afterwards was the Articles of Confederation.
I do want to see what people said.
At an American government.
Never read also, the YouTube comments, but I'm doing it.
Probably noticed that.
Where are the Greens at? John Green, where are you? Worst John Green impression ever. John Green or Riot. Oh God. I like him. I think he's funny.
The first American government, which was in place during the Revolutionary War and for almost 10 years afterwards, was the Articles of Confederation. Like many first attempts, the Articles government had some good ideas and it meant well, but it was poorly executed. Just give it a break. It never did this before. So when delegates gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 to revise the Articles...
So the Articles of Confederation, like I've said many times in the past, is that Skrillex over there? I think that's Skrillex. Sorry, I got distracted. The Articles of Confederation, one of its biggest flaws, it put too little power in the hands of the federal government. One of the biggest problems is that it had no real power to raise revenue, therefore, low taxing power. They relied upon basically the generosity of the individual states, which, states may hold out money from the federal government and just do their own thing. Some might throw a little bit in their direction, and some of the states are giving more or less than others. So it's a complicated relationship there when the government has no way of asserting its actual power if it doesn't have its own resources, and resources are money. We need money, and they don't have the power to raise money.
They ended up scrapping the whole thing and creating a new constitution. It's probably not because they didn't know what revise meant. So the delegates from the various states each had their own agendas at the Constitutional Convention, and that made it difficult for them to agree on what the new government should look like. In order to hammer out a constitution, they had to do something you don't see very much in government these days. Compromise. Oh, let's compromise. Sorry, I didn't mean. Before we get into what those compromises were, it's kind of necessary to look at what was so bad about the Articles government in the first place. The main thing was it really couldn't govern. There was no executive branch or president and no judiciary to settle disputes. It was basically just a Congress where each state was equally represented and they all pretty much had veto power and could sink legislation they didn't like. All decisions were collective, which meant that very few decisions were actually made, because it's really hard to get 13 people to agree on something that will be in the interest of all 13. I can barely agree with Stan on anything, right?
When different places, when places are so geographically far apart, they have different interests. Some places are more agricultural, some places are going to be more industrial in this emerging industrial world. So they will often have conflicting interests. So you don't want this sort of government where they can't come together in any meaningful way.
Dan? He said wrong. Most important, the Articles government had no power to levy taxes, which meant that if it needed any money to do, well, anything, it had to ask for the money from the states, which were free to say, no, I don't think we'll be giving you any money today or tomorrow.
So lame.
As I remember from my college years, and I don't remember much, living without money is awful. Without money, it's pretty much impossible for a government to do anything, except buy ramen noodles. The Articles government was able to accomplish one notable thing, though. One of the big issues it had to deal with was Americans moving out west, which in the 1770s and 80s meant to places like Ohio and Indiana that weren't states yet. The government managed to set up rules for these settlements in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. This set up a system for eventual statehood, but most importantly, it forbade slavery in these territories, which, as students of American history know, was kind of a big deal. You wouldn't know that. You're not a student of American history. You're a symbol of America.
Yeah, the issue of slavery, he's definitely going to go a bit more into this, so I won't go too deep into it at this point. But generally, slavery is complicated at this time. What do people believe about slavery? It's hard to really pin down a general consensus. white people, white men who were like the voters at the time, they definitely saw themselves as superior to black people, so they have that. But some of them did openly speak against slavery. How many of them actually did much against it? That's a little bit more here and there. We have a lot of people who are what I like to call do-nothing abolitionists, where they talk the talk but don't really walk the walk. Like Thomas Jefferson, he's a do-nothing abolitionist. He'll talk some nice game about abolishing slavery and whatever, but he doesn't really push for it when he has the most power to do so. He's a do-nothing abolitionist.
Bird. I'm not going to punch you. Other than that, though, the Article's government was a flop. And the very thing that made it so ineffective threatened to screw up any attempts at new government, too. This was the issue of competing interests between different states. More specifically, the states with large populations and the smaller states. Basically, a state with a large population, like, say, Virginia, had different needs than a state with a small population, like Delaware. More importantly, large states might stand to benefit more from any government spending. When the delegates decided to make a new Congress, these large population states wanted the number of representatives to that Congress to be proportional to the state's populations, which would mean that the larger states would have more representatives than the smaller ones. This idea, a large Congress made up of many delegates, was called the Virginia Plan because it was put forward by the delegates from Wisconsin. Just kidding, Virginia. The delegates from small New Jersey put forward a plan that would have a Congress where each state would send an equal number of representatives. In other words, something that looked a lot like the Article's government. This New Jersey plan would prevent smaller states from
an equal number of representatives. We'll see a lot. These plans will be kind of like the precursors to the individual houses in the legislature. We have the Senate, which kind of keeps the different states balanced between one another, and we have the House of Representatives, which takes population into account. And we end up mixing them together, but you kind of see as they're making these propositions that where kind of the origins of those are. Well, with this sort of plan, the origins actually go back even further because they already had something similar in the Articles of Confederation, but we're going to have another plan that gets put forward
being dominated
to oppose this one,
and also ensure that the large states wouldn't be able to vote themselves a bigger share of government spending. These two opposing interests threatened to scuttle the whole new government thing until Roger Sherman from Connecticut proposed the Great Compromise that gave us the bicameral legislature that we talked about in episode 2.
We talked about this one
sometimes. So the Great Compromise meant that we would have a two-house legislature, but this wasn't the only issue related to how the seats in Congress would be apportioned. The membership in the House would be based on the state's population, but at the time there was an issue about how to count that population. The issue was slavery, more specifically, how to count slaves as part of the state's population. Let's go to the thought bubble. The states with large slave populations like South Carolina and Virginia had a pretty big interest in counting these slaves for the purposes of determining representation.
So, here's the thing. Representation is based on population. To be part of the population, you have to be considered a person by some means. You don't count animals or property typically among your population. However, this is the exception here. While these people are considered less than people, and they're not willing to give these people the rights of full citizens, they do want to use them to bolster their population in order to get more representatives in the government. This is a total contradiction here, because you can't maintain that they're property but still have them count as your population. But they do. This is what they end up doing, and it's the 3/5 compromise. It's absolutely insane that this happened, and it only happened because the more populous states had a disproportionate amount of wealth and power that people were willing to compromise and give them a little bit more of what they wanted. But logically, this just falls apart with any sort of critical thinking today. You don't need me to tell you that. Are they people or are they property? You gotta pick one. And if they're people, They're citizens. If they're property, they don't count it in your population. It's so dumb.
And the states with few slaves didn't want them counted at all, because this would mean that the white non-slave people in those states with lots of slaves would effectively be better represented than the white non-slave people in the states with few slaves. The delegates at the Constitutional Convention solved this problem with another compromise that was decidedly less great. Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution includes the following clause. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union, according to the respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to a service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. If you're looking for the word slave, you won't find it. They're the ones described by the phrase 3/5 of all other persons. This is the notorious 3/5 compromise. What it means is that in order to
they really danced around the word.
You count the number of free people in the state, including indentured servants, and add to that number 3/5 of the number of non-free persons, otherwise known as slaves. So in terms of counting, each slave was worth 3/5 of each free person. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Anyway, this meant that the states with large populations of slaves would be disproportionately represented in Congress.
And the number doesn't really mean anything at all. Like 3/5 is very arbitrary. So they're more than half of a person? Huh. It's not like somebody's sitting down doing any real calculations for how much these people are worth. This is totally arbitrary.
But not quite so badly that most northern states with small numbers of slaves wouldn't vote for the Constitution. What this also did was enshrine the idea that slaves, who were mostly black,
at least not by any objective measure, is what I mean. Maybe they sat down and were like, well, if they're worth 3/5, we get a pretty good number. They definitely put some thought into that. That's true.
black were worth less than free people who were mostly white, and it embedded slavery into the Constitution. So before this Constitution of Compromise could go into effect, it had to be ratified by at least 9 of the 13 states. So each state had a special convention where delegates could vote on whether or not to adopt the new Constitution. These conventions were more open to the public than the Constitutional Convention itself, and the ratification process is the reason why some people say the Constitution is based on the will of the people. But not everybody wanted the Constitution, and they needed convincing. This is where things get a little...
I don't want it.
Want the Constitution? Did you?
I hope he talks about my state.
Public opinion about the Constitution was pretty evenly divided. Those who wanted the Constitution were called Federalists, largely because of the Federalist Papers, a series of articles written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They wrote the Federalist Papers to convince voters in New York to ratify the Constitution, and since New York did eventually ratify the document, I guess they worked. But we should listen to both sides of the argument in the Clone Zone. So joining us in the Clone Zone today will be Federalist Clone and Anti-Federalist Clone. Let's hear from Federalist Clone first. Fetty? Can I call you Fetty?
No. The Federalists were the incredibly intelligent Americans who thought that a strong central government would benefit the country as a whole. They tended to come from cities, and often they represented commercial classes, especially wealthy people who had lent money to the government during the Revolution. They liked the new Constitution because they felt that a strong national government would pay its debts, and this was good for business. They also tended to want stronger ties with England, again, because England was a good trading partner.
Like, immediately after the American Revolution, we turned around and were still trading with England. That's the thing. Like, we had that relationship with the French, but like as a trading partner, we didn't get nearly as much from them as we did from the British. Therefore, as soon as we get independence, we're looking back over at the British and we're like, okay, how can we both still benefit from like some semblance of a relationship here? So the Federalists, from a purely financial standpoint, were absolutely right to lean towards the British, especially over the French, who were going to be a mess in the near future.
Given the raging success of the Articles government, it's pretty clear that the Federalists were right.
Okay, now let's hear from Anti-Federalist Clone. How do you respond, Auntie? I'm not your aunt. Sure, Federalists were right to believe in tyranny. Anti-Federalists were right to be skeptical of a large government that would trample on our individual liberties. They didn't want a big government that would tax them to death and possibly take away their slaves. In general, Anti-Federalists felt that states would be the best protectors of people's rights and liberties because, being smaller, they would be more responsive to people's needs. Okay. The Anti-Federalists published pamphlets in our...
And he just casually was like, and maybe take away people's slaves. As if it's like, whatever. He doesn't get a weird look about it. It's really interesting because the Anti-Federalists were probably more in line with a certain group of the American Revolution. I often divide the American Revolution into a couple different generations. There's those who took part in the early rebellious actions, like the early boycotts of trade and whatever, and importation of tea and all that. I sometimes refer to them as the founding grandfathers or the grand founding fathers. But then there's the next generation of slightly younger people, often, who actually fought in the war, and they were often from a completely different generation and saw the downsides of a weak federal government, because during the war they weren't able to get the resources that they wanted. The states were not giving enough money to the military. They were not really contributing to this cause that was effectively fighting for them. So a lot of people who fought in the war ended up being Federalists as well, like George Washington, for example. While he was never formally in the Federalist Party, he was very Federalist leaning, and he supported the Constitution. And Alexander Hamilton, he fought in the war. He saw logistically how much not having a strong federal government failed them during the war, and how much it held them back.
Articles too, but we weren't quite as organized, so we didn't have a coherent set of anti-federalist papers to push on government students.
Okay, you seem really mad about this.
I am.
But you eventually lost the debate.
I did.
Huzzah!
How come he got to shoot fireworks?
I didn't know he was going to.
I wanted to shoot fireworks.
I'm sorry. Next time you can have fireworks.
So the Federalist position won out, and the Constitution was ratified, and that's the government that Americans have been living under ever since. Hooray! Because the Constitution was passed, we tend to think that everyone loved it, but it wasn't nearly as clear-cut as hindsight makes it appear.
It's
Eventually, the Federalists...
Right now, the Constitution is like this, essentially, like, it's like a biblical document in the United States. It is not to be questioned. The Constitution is the Constitution. You can't F with that sort of thing. But at the time, you could freely question the Constitution all you wanted. Nobody would, like, take a second look at you. It's like, yeah, of course he has an opinion on the Constitution. It's a controversial document.
Had to offer another compromise, promising a Bill of Rights in the first 10 amendments. This isn't called one of the constitutional compromises because it happened outside of the convention, but it was yet another example of how different interests had to give a little in order to get a constitution passed. It's very important to remember that compromise, the idea of balancing interests and giving a little to get a lot, is embedded in the Constitution. While today it seems like a political dirty word, compromise is the basis of the American government itself. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Well, I'll compromise. See you in a week and a half. Let's face it, Stan's probably not going to get this done in time anyway. Crash Course Government.
So we're probably going to get one on the Bill of Rights eventually, I would assume. The Bill of Rights is very interesting. There was a debate over whether or not they should have a Bill of Rights, which is a series of things that guarantees you the right to do certain things. It tells you what rights every individual citizen has. The right to free speech, the right to bear arms, the army can't live in your house, those sort of things. But those on the Federalist side were actually a little bit iffy about that, because they felt that including a Bill of Rights would actually take rights away from ordinary people by omission. Like, you'd forget something, and by the fact that you didn't include it, it would be implied that you don't have that right. That sort of thing. I think that'll probably be really interesting. I assume we'll touch on that at some point in the future. So, that's the post show, guys. I will be returning to this in a couple weeks, 2 or 3 weeks. I had a lot of fun. We're gonna run down these, and we're 5 episodes in. We're gonna make some more progress. I think it's got like 40 something episodes, so it might take a little while, but I'm enjoying them. And we're gonna be doing some other stuff sprinkled in between, of course. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you next week with another post show. If you have any ideas for what to do next time, let me know. If not, I'll come up with something. And I will see you in the next live stream on next Sunday, probably. I don't know. And yeah.